Well, we decided we would start applying ethics part two with greeting you. YouTube can be such great fun.
We're
As
so mature.
Absolutely, aren't you glad you signed up for this mess? We really want to pick up on the applying ethics part two. We, in part, this is again, I keep going back to the notion that this is complicated, and struggling with these ideas and struggling with the application of ethics to policy, because clearly it's embedded and it's a part of policy. It can't be separated. Um, we wanted to try and go over this in some detail. And so we left off with when and how does life become compromised? And remember, we ended up with um, Solberg's kind of thing. But the next piece is who should have the say so. So who makes those decisions around policy, applying policy, and who the outcome of who gets this or who gets that? How do we apply rights? How do we apply resources? Um, we're going to continue as we did before in going through each one of the readings. Davis would suggest that informed people, that part of the decision-making process of who has the right to say, is somebody who is informed, somebody who's knowledgeable. I remember it stems back to being multidisciplinary oriented. He talked about a biocultural mentality that when we think about disabilities, when we think about issues in general, we have to look at it from a multiple perspective, not just science, but humanism, literature, arts, humanities, all of those kinds
And
of things.
inherent in that is that a person who is not informed in those areas with facts, whatever they might be, should not be making policy. And that is contrary to much of the disability activism discussions of the late 20th century, where the slogan was nothing about us without us. Now, it would be interesting to now look at Davis and ask him, what do you think about that?
And but moving along, and to Koch's piece, the article there, in agreement with, and there again, Koch found himself pretty much in agreement with Johnson through most of the work, and that each individual and others who are enriched by the life of the individual. So just the whole notion about who should say so, that my connection with you, your connection with me, and my connection in the case they were talking about, maybe Terry Schiavo, was just that connection. Would be the enrichment. Reeve talks about it. Reeve really doesn't directly address the issue of who should say so, but implies that decisions about Homo sacer, again, help us with the pronunciation, lie in the hands of those in power. So the people who have power, and however you might define that, that those are the individuals, or that's the group that has the decision making.
And if any of you had taken previous disability classes with us and remember your history, there was a section on ancient Greece in which there was an assertion that infants who were deformed, seriously deformed, were thrown out as non-human. Now the question is, who makes that decision, and does that now look very familiar in policies of Homo sacer?
Well, and now to also kind of add to that a little bit in terms of some of the potential confusion and the struggle that we asked you last week in terms of utilizing $100 and applying it to different populations, is thinking about the issue that Solberg raises in terms of related to abortion. Um, and that Solberg's position is that any parent should have the right to abort, but not on the basis of population category. So Solberg allows for abortion to exist, and people to make decisions to abort on anything other than the identification that the fetus or potential fetus or whatever is at risk for having a disability.
And so, I mean, ultimately, what he's suggesting is that you should be able to abort if you want to, but you should not be able to abort on the basis of genocide or killing off an entire population.
And the next thing we're left with is, how do you know answer? The answer is by looking at policy. Clearly, you can't just look at rhetoric. What we're going to ask you to do in terms of looking at the policies for your final exam or your final paper for our class really is follow the logic of who's being stated, who's being provided, and what's the reason for that. Again, remember we began the lecture for this week talking about, as well as the one for last week, that you could look at the same policy and come at it from multiple perspectives. And so we understand that it's complicated. but it's in that complication and being able to kind of try to sort through it that I think understanding of policy and policy analysis is critical.
And one of the ways to follow the decision-making logic is to look at what are the arguments that preceded the policy, what are the contextual factors that influence the policy. You really have to do your homework and look at the history of a policy. Was it passed because, or was the law passed, or was a policy enacted because it should produce an outcome? Was it passed because it's a duty? Was it passed because everybody should have rights? Was it passed because of economic solvency for particular populations? Again, an outcome. So begin to look at that and see, am I looking here at consequentialist policy? Am I looking at non-consequentialist policy? Am I looking at virtue ethics, which suggests that I do something because I'm a good person? Or am I looking at duty ethics, which suggests, for example, that I am mandated by my position as either a social worker or whatever to report an ill?
And so what we're ultimately going to ask you to do this week is take the similar kind of struggle last week in terms of, as you know, each week what we're asking is that you respond to difficult questions that are being posed. And so thinking about the Koch article, which again we identify as difficult, how do the different ethical models that are espoused by Johnson and Singer guide their logic and result in different conclusions? So go back and look at that article in depth, realize that they're looking at a similar thing, and follow the logic of Singer and Johnson, and try and come up with a reason why they might end up with different conclusions.
And remember, there are no correct answers. You want to try to struggle with this to see if you can ferret out ethical themes that inhere in each of the policies and each of the ways in which Johnson and Singer came to different claims about the same issue.
And we finally have another no fence sitting position for you.
No fence sitting allowed.
You can't sit fence on this, because this really kind of helps us struggle and look at ethics and models of ethics.
And it forces you into
Right.
taking a position, and you don't necessarily have to agree with it in the long run, but take a position and work it through.
And we're going to ask you to post these conversations. We've had, now this will amount to about 3 different weeks of readings around prenatal testing, and clearly that's a part of some of the conversations within disability scholarship as well as the disability activism community. Should we or shouldn't we? We're going to ask you, what is your opinion on prenatal testing for Down syndrome? And we're asking you, first begin with an ethical model that you espouse, so try and identify what your model is. Work through the logic of that model, and if you need to go back to the literature, look up other literature that we've not read for this class around that model to kind of follow this, and then draw a conclusion, pro or con. No fence sitting not allowed on this one, and discuss how your model guided you to your conclusions. Good luck with this one.
Good luck.
We look forward to reading your responses, and we will participate as well. Anyway, thank you. Have a good week.